I was born in New York City in 1954, and my mother, father, and I lived with my grandmother, Liz White, as she was known up here on Martha's Vineyard. Liz Shearer White was the name she always went by. So we're from the family of Shearers who've been on the island since the late 1800s and have owned property up here since then. Specifically the Shearer Cottage, which is now Efficiency Apartments, but for most of the 20th century was a haven for African Americans who had the wherewithal to come here to visit either for religious purposes or strictly vacation purposes. My grandmother, Liz White, was very interested in the theater and involved in the theater, and along with acting, she was also a theatrical dresser. African Americans didn't have as many theatrical opportunities, of course, in the earlier part of the 20th century, so in order to support herself and her family, she became a theatrical dresser. When she was in her 20s, she did try to be a professional actress. She appeared in a Cab Calloway production of some sort. But she was quickly shut out of a lot of work because of the fact that she was very fair complected. And so it was difficult to tell that she was African American. And if they were going to use an African American in theater in those days, they had to look the part. She wasn't dark-skinned enough to be in that. So she quickly turned to theatrical dressing as a profession in order to support herself. And somewhere out of that, Shearer Summer Theater was born as a way for her to get her creative needs met during the summer when sometimes theaters went dark for a period of time. I know that for as long as I lived, my grandmother always made sure that her professional jobs, dressing people, were contracted in such a way that she always had the summers off. Complete summers off. And my grandmother was very, very good at her job, so she was always sought after by the stars to come and work for them. And so she had that leverage because she was so good. She could have that put into the contract. And so Shearer Summer Theater came about at some point in time during my grandmother's younger years, probably in her 30s or 40s. My grandmother she was activist in a lot of respects, and she made sure that there was a message of some sort that people could walk away with that almost always had to do with the state of race relations, either in the time in which the play takes place or in most cases also in the current time in which the play was being shown. She firmly believed in education as the way to resolve issues such as racism in America and so forth and so on, the whole gradations of color in the world. She felt education was the way. Now, my grandmother did something kind of fun and interesting during the 60s. Her vision, her creative vision, and her social consciousness came together to formulate what Shearer Summer Theater was about for the most part during the 60s. We started to have issues with businesses in town being dismayed, and this continues, as I understand it, right up to this day, with the collection of youth on Circuit Avenue in the evening hours. A lot of house parties back in those days, but you didn't have them every night. So when you didn't have one, what do? Well, that's kind of where they'd hang out in front of the arcade or the soda shop and so on and so forth. My grandmother was a member of the Cottagers, and as such, this came up in their meetings a lot because a lot of these women in the Cottagers were the mothers of these same kids that were hanging out on Circuit Avenue. So my grandmother decided, wouldn't it be nice if I could get these kids involved in theater? Give them something to do, educate them, fun for me, I'd have a good time, and so on. And so at that point, she began to put plays on that were done specifically so she could have a youthful cast for most of the parts. She did West Side Story with a bunch of kids to do modern jazz ballet dancing and almost operatic style singing when you think about what West Side Story really sounds like and looks like. That's an incredibly brave thing to do, and yet she put those productions on and didn't worry about them. She did a play called Fractured Fairy Tales one year, although she did that in the Tivoli in town, but West Side Story was done at the house, Twin Cottage. And so for 3 years or so, she had plays done specifically to get the kids off the street.